In the first week of July 2026, a team of Egyptian archaeologists working in the remote western desert of Egypt made an announcement that traveled around the world within hours. Buried under the sands of the Dakhla Oasis, more than 200 miles from the Nile River, they had uncovered something that almost never survives from the ancient world. Not a tomb, not a temple, an entire city, complete, articulated, preserved street by street, house by house, with its church still standing at the center, its watchtowers still guarding the edges, and its bakeries still holding the ovens where bread was made 16 centuries ago.
The headlines called it a lost Byzantine city, and then as always, the headlines moved on. But here is what almost no one told you. Inside that city, archaeologists recovered around 200 fragments of broken pottery covered in handwriting, real words, written by real people, in Greek and in Coptic, shopping records, personal letters, complaints, promises, the everyday voices of a community that vanished so completely that until this month the world did not even remember it existed. These fragments are the reason this discovery matters far beyond the headlines, and they will guide our entire journey today. And two of the houses in that city carry the names of the men who lived in them. One of those houses hides a secret that touches the deepest question in the history of Christianity. How did a persecuted, illegal, underground faith become the official religion of the most powerful empire on earth within a single human lifetime? In this video, we are going to walk through that city together. We will read its letters, count its gold coins, stand inside its hidden church, and follow its people to the very end of their world. Because this city did end. And the reason it died is a warning that speaks directly to our own civilization. Stay with me until the final chapter, because that is where the true revelation of Ain el Sabeel is waiting. Before we begin this journey, I want to ask you for a small favor that makes an enormous difference. We are a small and humble channel, and we depend completely on the kindness and support of people like you. If you enjoy serious history, told with verified sources and honesty, please take 1 second to subscribe to the channel, leave a like on this video, share it with someone who loves ancient mysteries, and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Every subscription, every like, and every comment helps this small channel keep researching and producing videos like this one. From the bottom of our hearts, thank you for watching our content. Now, let us go to the desert. To understand what was found, you first need to understand where it was found, because the location itself is almost impossible. Close your eyes and picture Egypt. You are probably picturing the Nile, the pyramids, the green ribbon of farmland running through a nation of sand. And that picture is correct, because for most of Egyptian history, 95% of the population lived within a few miles of that single river. The story we are about to tell, however, does not happen on the river. It happens in the one place where no city should ever have been possible. Now travel west, leave the Nile behind, cross more than 200 miles of one of the driest places on the planet, a landscape of dunes, gravel plains, and wind-carved rock, where rain may not fall for years at a time. This is the Western Desert, the eastern edge of the Great Sahara. And scattered across this ocean of sand, like islands, are the Oasis, Siwa, Baharia, Farafra, Karga, and the one that concerns our story, Dakhla. The Dakhla Oasis is a depression in the desert floor where ancient underground water rises close to the surface, creating palm groves and fields of wheat in the middle of absolute desolation. People have lived in Dakhla since the Stone Age. The pharaohs of the Old Kingdom sent governors here more than 4,000 years ago, and their mud brick palaces still lie beneath the sand. By the 4th century after Christ, under the rule of the Eastern Roman Empire, the empire that historians call Byzantine, this remote island of green was home to thriving, wealthy, and literate communities. One of those communities was built at a place known today as Ain el Sabeel, and in July of 2026, the Egyptian Archaeological Mission, working under the Supreme Council of Antiquities, announced to the world that they had finally uncovered it. They did not find a fragment of it. They did not find a corner of it. They found a fully articulated residential city built entirely of mud brick, with a planned street grid, a central basilica church, defensive towers, a fortress, houses, kitchens, and bakeries. The announcement was confirmed by Sherif Fatih, the Egyptian Minister of Tourism and Antiquities, who called it a significant addition to the record of Egyptian archaeology. Hisham el-Lithi, Secretary General of the Supreme Council of Antiquities, explained that the true importance of the discovery lies in the precise new information it provides about daily life in the Oasis during the Byzantine era. Mahmoud Massoud, the director of Dakhla Antiquities and the head of the excavation, described a settlement that had every architectural element a functioning community needs. Think about how rare that is. Archaeology usually gives us palaces without villages, temples without homes, kings without ordinary people. Here the desert preserved the opposite. The desert preserved everyone. But before we walk through its streets, we need to answer a question that the news reports skipped entirely. What was the Byzantine Empire doing 200 miles deep in the Sahara in the first place? The answer involves gold, grain, God, and fear. The word Byzantine can be misleading, so let us define it honestly, the way we always do on this channel. There was never a country that called itself Byzantinian. The people we call Byzantines called themselves Romans because that is exactly what they were. In the year 284 after Christ, the Roman Empire had grown too large to be governed by one man, and the Emperor Diocletian divided its administration. The western half, ruled from Italy, would collapse under invasions in the 5th century. The eastern half, ruled from Constantinople, would survive for more than 1,000 years, and historians gave it the nickname Byzantine. Egypt belonged to that eastern half, and Egypt was not just any province. Egypt was the treasure chest of the empire. Its fields fed Constantinople, its taxes filled the imperial treasury, its port of Alexandria was one of the greatest commercial and intellectual centers on earth. Whoever held Egypt held the lifeline of the Roman world. And holding Egypt meant holding its deserts. The oases of the Western Desert were not decorative possessions. They were strategic assets, and the empire treated them with a seriousness that most modern histories have completely forgotten to mention. The oases controlled the caravan routes that connected the Nile Valley to the interior of Africa. Routes that carried gold, salt, slaves, alum for dyeing cloth, and exotic goods. They produced dates, olives, wine, and cotton that the river valley could not match, and they served another purpose, one with a darker edge. Because of their extreme isolation, the oases were used as places of exile. Troublesome politicians, disgraced officials, and inconvenient bishops were sent to the Western Desert to disappear from public life without being executed. The great patriarch Athanasius of Alexandria himself was exiled to the desert regions during the theological wars of the 4th century. So picture Ain el Sabeel now with new eyes. Not a forgotten village at the end of the world, but a node in an imperial network. A place where tax collectors kept records, where soldiers watched the horizon, where caravans rested, and where, as we will soon see, the money of the emperor himself circulated in gold. But if the empire reached this deep into the desert, something else did too, something the inhabitants feared enough to build towers against. Hold that thought, because the towers of Ain el Sabeel will tell their own story later in this video. First, let us push open the city gate. What the archaeologists found when they cleared the sand was not a random pile of ruins. It was order, deliberate, geometric, planned order. The city of Ain el Sabeel is organized around main roads running from north to south, crossed by side streets running from east to west. Where the streets intersect, they form open squares and public spaces, and at the very center of this grid, facing one of the main arteries, stands the most important building in the community, a church, built in the architectural form known as a basilica, dated to the middle of the 4th century after Christ. This layout is a message written in urban planning. Villages that grow naturally, house by house, generation after generation, look like tangled webs. Their streets curve and dead-end. Ain el Sabeel does not look like that. Its regular plan suggests intentional foundation or deliberate reorganization, the kind of project that requires authority, surveying, organized labor, and a clear idea of what a community should be. Someone decided where the streets would go before the streets existed. In the middle of the Sahara, that single fact tells us the empire was not merely present here. The empire was building here with purpose. The construction material was mud brick, bricks of earth and straw, shaped in wooden molds and dried in the sun. To modern ears that sounds poor, but in the desert climate, mud brick is brilliant engineering. It is cheap, it is fast, and it insulates against the brutal heat of the day and the cold of the desert night. The houses of Ain el Sabeel had large rooms and vaulted ceilings, elegant curved roofs of brick, built without a single wooden beam, a technique perfected in Egypt over thousands of years. These vaults are one reason the city survived so well beneath the sand. Inside those houses, the archaeologists found life itself. Ovens for baking bread, kitchens, grinding stones for turning grain into flour, ceramic vessels for cooking and storage, small clay lamps that once burned oil to light the rooms after sunset, delicate flasks called ampullae that held perfumes and precious oils. Stop and absorb that detail. Perfume flasks. 200 miles into the Sahara, at the edge of the known world, people cared about how they smelled. They wanted comfort, beauty, and small daily luxuries. They were not survivors clinging to existence. They were citizens living a full provincial life. At the two ends of the city rose watchtowers, and nearby stood a fortress with notably thick walls. We will return to those defenses because they hide one of the most dramatic threads of this story. But the heart of the discovery is not the street grid, not the vaulted ceilings, and not the fortress. The heart of the discovery is two private houses, two ordinary homes that carry the names of the men who owned them. And through those two names, Ain el Sabeel is about to show us something historians almost never get to see. The exact moment a religion comes out of hiding. The first house belongs to a man named Tabipus. It was built at the beginning of the 4th century after Christ. The second house belongs to a man named Tizus, and the excavators identify him as a deacon, an ordained official of the Christian church. His house was built in the second half of the same century. Between those two houses, in time and in meaning, stands the basilica at the center of the city, dated to the middle of the 4th century. 3 buildings, one single century, and inside that century, the greatest religious transformation in the history of the Western world. Let us set the stage honestly. At the moment the house of Tabipus was built, Christianity was illegal. In the year 303 after Christ, the Emperor Diocletian had launched the last and most violent persecution of Christians in Roman history. Churches were demolished, scriptures were burned, believers were arrested, tortured, and executed. And listen carefully to this, Egypt suffered some of the worst of it. The Coptic Church of Egypt still counts its calendar from the era of Diocletian, which it calls the era of the martyrs. That is how deeply those years scarred this land. In those years of persecution, Christians could not build churches, so they worshipped in secret inside private homes. Historians call such a place a domus ecclesia, a house church, an ordinary residence from the street and a hidden sanctuary within. And here is the hypothesis the archaeologists of Ain el Sabeel have placed on the table. The house of Tabipus, built at the start of the 4th century, may have functioned as exactly that, a house church, a secret gathering place for believers, before any public church existed in the city. If confirmed, it is a snapshot of underground Christianity at the very edge of the empire. Then everything changed. In the year 313 after Christ, the Emperor Constantine and his colleague Licinius issued the agreement known as the Edict of Milan, which made Christianity legal throughout the Roman world. The persecution ended, the prisons opened, And for the first time in 3 centuries, Christians could worship in daylight. Now watch what happens in the archaeology of our little desert city. In the middle of the 4th century, a basilica rises at the very center of the urban grid, facing a main street. The faith leaves the private house and takes the most visible position in the entire settlement. By the second half of the century, we meet Jesus the deacon, a man whose religious office is part of his public identity, a recognized official of an institutional church. His house tells us that the church now has hierarchy, administration, and social standing. Do you see the miracle of this site? In most of the Roman world, this transformation is described only in texts. In Ain el Sabeel, you can walk it. You can physically step from the house of the secret believer to the public basilica, to the home of the church official. 3 buildings, a few streets apart, recording the journey of Christianity from crime to establishment. And there is one more piece of evidence, small enough to fit in your palm, that seals this story in metal: the coins. But to understand what is written on those coins, we first need to follow the money of Ain el Sabeel. And the money is about to reveal something surprising. This forgotten city in the middle of nowhere was rich, not rich in legend, rich in documents, rich in bronze, and rich in imperial gold. In the next chapter, the city itself will speak in its own handwriting and tell us exactly how its people earned, spent, and worried about money.
Among the most significant finds announced by the excavation team is a collection of around 200 ostraka. An ostrakon is a fragment of broken pottery used as writing material. Papyrus was relatively expensive, broken pots were free, and the dry desert air preserves ink on ceramic almost forever. So the people of the Oasis wrote on potsherds constantly, the way we scribble on sticky notes today. The 200 ostraka of Ain el Sabeel are the written memory of the city, and their contents are about to bring its streets back to life.
The Ostraka are written in 2 languages, Greek and Coptic. Greek was the language of administration, commerce, and the educated elite of the Eastern Empire. Coptic was the final stage of the ancient Egyptian language, the direct descendant of the tongue of the pharaohs, written in an alphabet adapted from Greek letters. The same community used both languages side by side, in the same streets and sometimes surely in the same households. That simple fact reveals a bilingual, layered society where imperial culture and deep Egyptian identity lived together, traded together, and prayed together at the edge of the world. And what do these texts contain? According to the excavation directors, they record commercial transactions, purchases and sales, personal letters, and the small administrative details of daily life. Please do not let the modesty of that description fool you. Receipts and letters are the rarest treasure in ancient history. Chronicles tell us about emperors. Ostraka tell us about everyone else. What barley cost, who owed money to whom, who wrote to a relative in another village, and what they worried about. When these texts are fully published, Ain el Sabeel will speak to us in its own voice. This channel will follow that publication closely, and if you want to be here when those letters are finally read, that is exactly what the subscribe button is for. It genuinely helps our small channel more than you can imagine. Now, the coins. The team recovered a large number of bronze coins in an excellent state of preservation, carrying the portraits of Byzantine emperors, inscriptions in Latin, and Christian symbols. Bronze was the everyday money of the empire, the coinage of the market and the bakery. Its abundance tells us that Ain el Sabeel had a fully monetized economy, not primitive barter. But alongside the bronze, the archaeologists found gold. A group of gold coins from the reign of the Emperor Constantius II, who ruled the Roman world from the year 337 to the year 361 after Christ. Gold coinage in this period means the salutis and its fractions, the hardest and most trusted currency on the planet, the ancient equivalent of a strong reserve currency. Gold did not wander into a desert oasis by accident. Gold arrived where the state paid salaries, where officials operated, where serious commerce flowed, and where real wealth accumulated. Look closely at those coins one more time because they carry the final proof of the religious revolution we witnessed in the last chapter. On one side, the face of the emperor, around it, Latin words proclaiming his power, and stamped into the same small disc of metal, the symbols of Christ. Empire and faith fused into a single object that passed through every hand in the city. The son of Constantine, ruling as a Christian monarch, his gold glittering in a desert town 200 miles beyond the Nile. So why did these prosperous people look toward the horizon and build towers? At the two ends of the city stand watchtowers. Near them, a fortress with unusually thick walls. Defensive architecture is never decoration. It is fear, translated into brick. The excavation team connects these structures to the conditions of insecurity that troubled parts of the empire during late antiquity, and the history of the region tells us exactly what that insecurity looked like, because the desert around the Oasis was not empty. It was inhabited, contested, and increasingly dangerous, precisely during the same golden century in which Ain el Sabeel was building its basilica and counting its gold. Toward the south of Egypt lived the Blamies, nomadic peoples of the eastern desert and Nubia, famous in Roman sources as raiders of frontier settlements. Late antique authors, including the historian Olympiodorus of Thebes, who personally traveled among desert peoples in the 5th century, describe an Egypt whose southern and desert frontiers were under recurring pressure. To the west of the Oasis roamed Libyan desert tribes, and Roman documents from the Oasis region record raids so severe that entire communities appealed for military protection. Christian sources of the period even tell of raiders carrying away captives and demanding ransoms in the Oasis. For a place like Ain el Sabeel, wealthy, isolated, and days away from any legion, a raid was not a distant rumor. It was the nightmare scenario. The nearest imperial troops were far away. If riders appeared on the horizon at dawn, the city had only its own walls, its own towers, and its own courage. This is why the fortress matters so much to historians. It tells us that the golden age of the Oasis carried a shadow. The same isolation that protected these cities from political chaos left them exposed to enemies, and every gold coin was a reason for someone to sharpen a blade. There is a larger pattern hiding here, one that students of civilizational collapse will recognize immediately. When an empire is strong, its frontiers are quiet, and its taxes buy safety. When an empire begins to strain, the frontier feels it first. Watchtowers rising over a provincial town are an early symptom of a system spending more and more just to hold what it already has. The Roman world of the 4th century still looked mighty, but in the desert they were already watching the horizon. The towers of Ain el Sabeel are stones, but they are also a diagnosis. The people of Ain el Sabeel survived those threats. Their city was not burned, no layer of ash, no scattered weapons, no signs of massacre have been announced by the excavators. Whatever ended this city, it was not a sword, it was something slower, something quieter, something that no tower can stop. But before we face the ending, we need to widen the camera one last time. Because Ain el Sabeel did not live alone. It was part of a constellation of desert cities whose story is even stranger, and one of its neighbors preserved a secret library that shocked the scholarly world. A few miles from Ain el Sabeel lie the ruins of a city the ancients called Kelis, known today as Ismant el Karab. Excavated for decades by an international mission connected to Monash University in Australia, Kelis is one of the most extraordinary archaeological sites in all of Egypt, and almost no one outside the academic world has ever heard its name. Kelis produced thousands of written texts, letters, contracts, accounts, school books, and prayers, in Greek, in Coptic, and in Syriac. It also contains some of the oldest church buildings ever excavated in Egypt, from the early 4th century. Hidden inside the private homes of Kelis, archaeologists found something astonishing: the largest archive of Manichaean texts ever discovered in a domestic setting. Manichaeism was a rival world religion founded in the 3rd century by the Persian prophet Mani, blending Christian, Zoroastrian, and Buddhist ideas into a dramatic cosmic struggle between light and darkness. The Roman state persecuted it ruthlessly, and yet here, in the same oasis where official Christianity was raising its basilicas, Manichaean families were quietly copying their forbidden scriptures and mailing letters to fellow believers along the caravan routes of the desert. Do you feel how alive this desert suddenly becomes? Within a few miles of sand, we have underground Christians becoming public Christians, a state church rising in the town square, and a forbidden rival faith whispering in private houses. The Dakhla Oasis in the 4th century was not a sleepy frontier. It was a spiritual battlefield in slow motion, a miniature of the entire late Roman world. Whatever tension, hope, or fear existed in the great cities of the empire, it existed here too, compressed into a few green miles surrounded by infinite sand. The constellation continues beyond Calis. Nearby stood Ameheda, ancient Trinities, excavated by New York University, a Roman town with painted villas and a schoolroom where Greek poetry is still written on the walls in red ink. There was Motis, the ancient capital of the Oasis. There were farms, monasteries, and temples of the old Egyptian gods, slowly falling silent as the new faith spread. Tens of thousands of people living rich and complicated lives in a place most maps simply painted empty, all of them connected by caravans, by letters, and by one shared, invisible foundation that made everything possible.
That foundation was water, not the Nile, not the rain, water from another age. Beneath the western desert lies fossil water, rain that fell in prehistoric times when the Sahara was green, trapped in deep sandstone layers for thousands of years. The oasis dwellers reached it through springs and wells, and in some places the pressure of the aquifer pushed the water up on its own in flowing artesian wells that must have looked like pure miracle. Managed through generations of canals, cisterns, and careful customary law, this ancient water made civilization possible in the driest place on earth.
But fossil water has one terrifying property. It does not renew. Every bucket raised in Ain el Sabeel was a withdrawal from an account that nature was no longer filling. The people of the oasis could not know it, but they were living on borrowed water, and the loan was coming due. Now we are ready. We have seen the city live, trade, pray, and defend itself. We have met its neighbors and touched its foundations. It is time to answer the question this entire video has been building toward. Let us watch a world end. The strangest fact about Ain el Sabeel is the manner of its death. The city was not destroyed. Its walls did not fall in fire. Its people were not slaughtered in the streets. The excavation reveals a community that was inhabited, maintained, and then, at some point, simply left. The vaulted houses stood empty. The wind carried the first sand into the doorways. And the desert, patient as eternity, began to swallow the city whole, preserving it like an insect in amber. What kills a city without touching it? The answer comes in three slow forces. The first force was the water itself. Centuries of intensive agriculture drew down the fossil aquifers. Springs weakened. Wells had to be dug deeper, demanding more labor for less return. In a community where every field, every palm tree, and every human life depended on flowing water, a declining well was not an inconvenience. It was a countdown. No one would have noticed it in a single year or even in a single generation. But decade after decade, the margin of survival grew thinner, and the oasis needed more effort simply to remain what it had always been. The second force was the transformation of the world around the oasis. In the year 641 after Christ, Egypt fell to the Arab conquest, and the Byzantine province became part of a new Islamic civilization. This was not the end of life in the oasis, and it is important to say so honestly, but it rewired everything. Trade routes shifted, the imperial system that had paid gold into the desert, garrisoned its forts, and valued the oasis as strategic frontier assets was gone. Over generations, the region slowly Arabized, and the old Christian towns lost the networks that had sustained them. The third force was the desert itself. Oasis agriculture is a constant war against sand. Canals must be cleared, dunes must be held back, wells must be maintained every single year forever. That war requires people, organization, and surplus. The moment population declines and institutions weaken, the maintenance falters. And the moment maintenance falters, the desert advances, which drives more people away, which weakens maintenance further. A death spiral, turning quietly decade after decade. Fewer hands, less water, more sand. Repeat until silence. That is the entire tragedy, compressed into 7 words. Students of collapse will recognize the deep pattern beneath all 3 forces. Complex societies survive by paying constant costs in energy, in labor, and in organization just to stay where they are. As long as the returns justify the costs, the system holds. When the returns fall, when the water table drops, when the empire stops paying, when the routes move, the mathematics of survival quietly reverses. No dramatic villain is required, no barbarian horde, no earthquake, no plague. Sometimes a civilization does not fall, it simply stops being worth maintaining, and the people, one family at a time, walk away. That is what the sands of Dakhla preserved for us, not a catastrophe, a decision repeated by hundreds of households across generations until one morning there was no one left to bake bread in the ovens of Ain el Sabeel. The city did not scream, it exhaled, and the desert, which had waited patiently at the edge of the fields for 1,000 years, finally came in through the open doors. And now, as promised at the very beginning of this journey, the true revelation of this discovery, it is not what you expect. Here it is. The revelation of Ain el Sabeel is that nothing about it was exceptional. That sentence sounds like a disappointment. It is exactly the opposite. The people of this city were not heroes of legend. They were bakers, farmers, letter writers, deacons, mothers, merchants, and warriors. They lived through one of the greatest transformations in human history, the conversion of an empire, and they experienced it not as a chapter in a book, but as changes on their own street. A neighbor's living room where people once prayed behind closed doors. A new church rising in the square. New symbols on the coins in their purses. And they lived, without knowing it, through the early stages of the other great story, the slow unwinding of the world that sustained them. They watched the wells, they repaired the canals, they trusted that the water and the empire would last, because both had always lasted. We are not so different. Our civilization also rests on flows we rarely think about. Water, energy, trade, trust, and institutions, all demanding constant maintenance, all invisible until they falter. The lesson of the desert is not fear, it is attention. Civilizations are not owned, they are rented, and the rent is due every single day. The excavations at Ain el Sabeel are only beginning. Roughly 200 written voices are waiting to be read, and the peer-reviewed publications are still ahead of us. Everything you heard today rests on the official announcements of the Egyptian Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities and on the established archaeology of the Dakhla Oasis. And as always on this channel, when new evidence emerges, we will update the story, honestly with sources, and with both sides of every debate, because history deserves nothing less, and because you, watching right now, deserve nothing less than the truth as far as it can be known. If this journey into the forgotten desert moved you, taught you something, or simply kept you wondering, please remember that we are a small and humble channel that exists only because of viewers like you. Subscribing costs nothing, but for us it means everything. Leave a like so more people can discover this story, share this video with a friend who loves lost worlds, and tell us in the comments, what do you think the letters of Ain el Sabeel will say? Thank you sincerely and truly for watching until the end. The desert kept this city safe for 16 centuries so that someone, someday, would remember its people. Tonight, that someone was you.